It's an honor and privilege also to be with all of you. And thank you so much for the invitation, Natalia. It's pretty exciting to see how much work there's been on landscapes that's been developing in the CGIAR over the last years. And I think there's actually a pretty exciting future. And I wanted to just share some of my reflections with you. First, to say a little bit about why I think we are in a very different era than the era when the CGIAR came to prominence, and that we need a very different framing for the kind of research agenda that we have. And then I'm going to then, after that, talk to you about what I think the implications are for the design and the focus of research. And then later we'll maybe get a chance to talk about how we might be able to link with 1,000 landscapes. But if you'll move to the next slide.
Okay.
Actually, just go ahead into the one that shows the picture of the silos. I think historically, for at least the last 150 years, agriculture and land use have been spatially separated. That's been seen as a desirable thing, to move farming away from protected areas, to carve out watershed areas. You see this in all of our institutions, in terms of government institutions have different ministries for different products and for different parts of the land. And similarly, our research institutions were also organized in this very siloed way. And the focus for that was to optimize for the specific activity. So we would have areas for cropping, and we would try to maximize cropping from those areas, and really actually kind of intentionally limit the way we looked at the rest of the landscape, and particularly exclude competitive types of activities from the space in which we were focused. If you move to the next line, next space, one of the next slide, sorry, one of the things that has been now recognized as a result of the massive population growth of the last 150 years and the changes in land use patterns is that vision of the separation is a very artificial one in most places. Not everywhere, but in most places. Actually, most agricultural land today is intimately interconnected with other resource uses. You can split the difference where some other activity would be going on, whether it's environmental management or infrastructure or urban settlements, et cetera. So this is really the context in which production needs to be considered. And it's also the context in which environmental management needs to be considered. If you go to the next slide with a big map, this is an old map from 2000, which shows just the area, many of you have seen this before probably, in which the production crop agriculture as a percentage of the land area in a pixel. And you see just these huge areas where certainly more than 40% and often more than 60% of the land is in crops. Well, that 60% has a huge environmental impact on the rest of the land around it. So when we talk about ecosystem management, in much of the world, we're talking about the management of agricultural landscapes in which production activities are central for the flows of ecosystem services, et cetera. So we're really not talking anymore about the idea of externalities is just an outdated concept. These are actually internal to the system. So if you move to the next one, it's also no longer about sustainability. I mean, we're talking about agriculture facing pretty existential threats due to everything from desertification and soil degradation. I'm sure I'm speaking to people who know enormous amounts about this, but when you put together the impacts of climate change, the fact that agriculture's got to face higher wind velocities and changes in pests and diseases that farmers are unfamiliar with, high frequency of flooding events. We're really talking about situations in which just improved varieties are not going to get the job done here. Just a few tweaks to existing systems are not going to get the jobs done. We really need to rethink what we mean. We'd be lucky if we could be sustainable, but we're facing a lot of potential catastrophic situations in many agricultural areas. If you go to the next slide, it's also no longer about this sort of false trade-off analysis that we've all done. I'm an economist by training. I was trained in trade-off analysis. Are you better off to get a little more agriculture or a little more environment? That is a question of the past. Our production systems and our landscapes need to produce both food and ecosystem services. We can't survive a trade-off mentality and a trade-off outcome. Not to say that that isn't the existing situation, but we need to aim for overcoming those trade-offs, not choosing one or the other. And finally, it's no longer about managing resources for food and agriculture only. We don't have our rural areas, our policymakers can't be thinking that they need to prioritize food only, because cities and industry and other sectors play a huge role in the use, management, ownership, etc., of the rural resources that we need for farming and the urban resources that we need for farming and food production. So it's really not, we've got to be thinking about the wide variety of products and services that come out of our farms and that are used by our resources. So if we look at the Sustainable Development Goals, we need to be really, I'll go to the next slide and then actually go to the one after that, the one that says leave no one behind. We need to be reconceptualizing our landscapes as the place where all of the Sustainable Development Goals are being met for everyone in every landscape or territory. So if this is our objective, it really requires a rethinking of the future of agriculture and land use. So if you move to the next slide, Natalia, we need to be thinking, we clearly do need increased production of food. And in some places, it needs to be quite a dramatic increase in the production of food. We can't rely on trade to feed Africa. So or South Asia. But the question is, how can we achieve agricultural growth, production growth, without simplifying our landscapes? This is the real question, is the idea of large extensions of annual monoculture crops is not going to be a viable solution either for production or for ecosystem services and environmental management. If that's the case, then we need to be looking at how do we increase crop genetic diversity, crop species diversity, wild species diversity, habitat diversity, and landscape diversity. And this is going to be a requirement for the resilience of our food systems, as well as for the, basically for the viability of our ecosystems and biodiversity. So if you move to the next slide, what this calls for then is we need to take seriously that our agricultural landscapes are the focus of multi-stakeholder negotiation. And I know many of you have worked on this at the level of individual landscapes, but I think what we have not achieved is a policy framework in which this is assumed to be the way that decisions are being made in landscapes, about land use, about land management, about the policies across different sectors and how they will have an incidence on individual landscapes. So it does mean that we need to have a focus in our research on answering questions that can be can be useful in negotiations. And again, many groups in the CGIAR have worked on negotiation support research, including around landscapes. And I think this really does call for different kinds of research design, different kinds of research questions. So if you'll move to the next slide, one of the things that we've seen, and I'm sure all of you all have seen, is just the enormous response by people on the ground to this new reality, to this new era where the agriculture production is in the context of managing all of ecosystems. And my list now of synonyms for integrated landscape management just reached 104. And so these are just different entry points with people with different focus. If they come in more with a water question or more of a sustainable, like green growth focus, they have slightly different approaches. It's extremely exciting to see this level of innovation, but it also has led to a fragmentation of effort where policymakers just don't have an understanding that this is actually a major phenomenon that's going on around the world. So if you go to the next slide, this is a map that Natalia had a role in producing. This is data from a series of 4 continental reviews of landscape initiatives, really during the period of 2012 to 2015, 2016. The numbers are much higher now, and we also know we've all documented more than 50 in the United States now, and a lot in Australia and other places that were not included in this original set of studies. So we know this is happening on a pretty large scale. And in fact, if you look at the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Convention on Biological Diversity, the CCD, the High-Level Political Forum for the Sustainable Development Goals, all of the, and UN Habitat even, have all embraced integrated landscape or territorial approaches as ways that we're going to move forward in terms of addressing food. So there's become a recognition also at the policy level that this is an approach to do this. But and let me just move to the next slide. I won't go through this very briefly. This just shows that some of that preliminary evidence showed that in fact, where you have multiple objectives and stakeholder negotiations and coordinated, coherent strategies of development in landscapes, you actually do meet multiple sustainable development goals, including agricultural yield growth and agricultural incomes, as well as other environmental and social benefits. So if you'll move to the next slide, as we're thinking then of what does it take to have successful agricultural landscapes that meet the Sustainable Development Goals, we're really thinking about a whole portfolio of investments and action activities by the public, private, and civic sectors that will come together to create those flows for biological corridors, those flows for sustainable water management and watershed sourcing, vibrant, diverse markets. So we'll need a series of asset investments that are environmentally friendly and socially inclusive. And it's not just on the production side, we need it on the value chain, industry, green infrastructure, built infrastructure. And we need a lot of investment in the enabling areas that will allow this kind of coherence to take place in terms of moving forward. And obviously research and innovation systems are really key. So are we as agricultural and natural resource management researchers positioning and situating our research in this field, in this context? This is the question I'm posing today. We need to think about, we may want to focus on crop production, but we need to focus on crop production within this context, where the most important thing might be getting agro industries upstream to clean up their pollution of the water being used to irrigate your crops. And that actually becomes a critical part of establishing successful food systems. So if this is our current situation, let's move next to the question of what does that imply about the research priorities to meet this integrated landscape challenge. And let me ask you, Natalia, to bring forward first this first process. When we think about integrated landscape management, we've put together what we call the action framework for integrated landscape management, and this has been refined by the 1,000 Landscapes for 1 Billion People Coalition. And we're looking at sort of 5 key elements in this. And my argument would be that each one of these 5 process elements also themselves need a lot more research. We've learned a lot in the last 20 years, but we're still just at the edge of understanding these processes. One is how you form and sustain and negotiate within these landscape partnerships over time. These are generational entities, formal or informal. Do they need to be formal, or is it okay for them to be informal? How are they linked with institutions below, lower down at the community level, and how are they linked with national government institutions? All of those questions. You then have the element of generating a shared understanding among the stakeholders of what's going on in the landscape, assess various kinds of social, environmental, production, economic assessment, financial assessments that generate a shared data and shared understanding of the landscapes. How can we make that process cheaper and easier? The third element is developing the vision for the future. planning for the long term and also doing action planning for the short term. How can we make that process more effective? The fourth element is the taking action and financing all of these investments that are required. How can we come up with how can we do research that will shift the way the financial system is working so that it supports these integrated landscape portfolios as opposed to project by project, highly fragmented investment strategies, which is all that we really have available to us right now. And then finally, the learning and impact assessment. We're getting better at integrated landscape investment analysis, but it's still not very easy for people to use in the process of improving their strategies for their own landscapes. So that's a first set of major research activities that are needed. If you go to the second area, we still need a lot of work in genetics and breeding because we're living in a different world and we need to breed for very different kinds of contexts and different kinds of activities. So this is just my own list I've been putting together over the years of what I would like to see more genetic research being done on. Obviously, most of these will be familiar with you all. You know, how do we increase carbon sequestration and storage, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, increase resilience? Are there ways to get food and vegetative biomass to be increased? What would that give us? How do we improve performance in biodiverse systems? Can we do more of our research studies under shade so that we can have these multi-strata, more protective and biodiverse systems in our production areas? You know, obviously reducing agrochemical input requirements across the board, domesticating many more species and making them market ready in terms of understanding how they can be processed. You know, a lot of the cool work being done with agroforestry species, and this needs to be dramatically scaled up and really at the commercial level. Do we want to pursue the perennializing annuals as a strategy? To what extent, where, and how do we link much more effectively with farmer seed sharing networks? So the third big area for research is systems research. We need to understand how to make these landscape systems at different scales work more effectively. We need to be integrating, or at least coordinating, our research on genetics, agronomic, and NRM research, which we are really just not doing right now. We need to understand, we've been doing an awful lot of, you know, what in the old biology world was sort of the naturalist going around and collecting information from observation, because we just don't have the budgets to do the sophisticated systems research. That's really, I think, the big opportunity for the next generation. We need to understand patterns of adoption and complex systems innovation a lot better than we do. I would argue that universities and research centers need to establish long-term partnerships with some of these large multi-stakeholder landscape initiatives so that they can sort of accompany them in an action research mode over a long period and really look at different elements within that system within an integrated framework. I won't go through all of these, but I think we need to, how can we accelerate natural resource restoration? We've already learned a lot about doing that. Can we do more? And how do we track change? And then there's the whole question about developing institutional solutions for how do you get these very diverse landscapes? How can we put in place innovation systems that will serve these landscape systems? What do those institutions look like? And then if you want to go to the slide here on the fourth area for research is about how do we evaluate our research in general. We need to look at, we need to be thinking about adoption, not just by farmers, but adoption by institutions, adoption by local governments, adoption by landscape partnerships, adoption by financial actors, et cetera, not just farmers. We need to be obviously studying impacts across production, resilience, environment, and well-being at the landscape scale. And we need to be focused a lot on the interactions among the different elements in the landscape and understanding the nature of those interactions and how they influence outcomes. There's clearly a limited scope for things like randomized controlled trials because these are complex systems evaluations. And I think we need to do a lot more at looking at methods for large scale sampling and look at more focus on how we can do more reliable modeling. But finally, is that we need to incorporate the context, the ecosystem and mosaic context into our assessments of adoption and impact of all types of research innovations. We can't just do them see them as independent interventions. So that's if you go to the last one, that's the end of my thing. For me, as a I was a researcher for 25 years, and I think that we're entering an enormously exciting period of research. And what I'm hoping is that the funding mechanisms and the policymakers supporting research organizations, as we move into an era of addressing climate change, biodiversity, food systems, that we will see a major movement in this kind of direction. And I'd love to hear your all's responses.